This is your first PowerPoint for Unit 2 about economics, and I want to talk generally today about the issue of human trade and how essential it is. You know, we've talked in class about changing continuity. This is probably one of the biggest continuities we study about in AP World History, and it's the constant human trade that happens throughout human history. If we go back to the very beginnings of human history, so this is when we start to see the ancient hominids that come out of Africa, there was a very brief moment in time in which human beings probably didn't trade with each other over wide areas. But very quickly, human societies are going to begin trading with each other, and it's a continuity that happens over and over again. And it is really significant because human trade is going to lead to the diffusion of ideas, the diffusion of technologies, the diffusions of architecture, and the mixing in, or what we call syncretism, of different cultures. So human trade is probably one of the biggest facilitators for change in what happens in human societies. So the continuity of trade. About 25,000 years ago, people left Africa in order to find warmer climates, probably due to climatic changes that took place due to the littler ice ages. Throughout this time, trade occurred between small villages or sedentary city-states. The major trade routes that occurred all the way up until the 1500s included the following: the Silk Road, which stretched from Europe out to China, the Indian Ocean, which would end up connecting Africa, the Middle East and Eastern Europe, the Andean Mountains, which connected all of Mesoamerica, the Mediterranean, which connected southern Europe to northern Africa, and the Trans-Saharan, which would connect western Africa out to the Middle East. The Silk Roads. There really wasn't a Silk Road, there was rather Silk Roads, and they began under the Han Dynasty. And they began because the Chinese were able to sell silk, which came from the mulberry tree. Women would make silk from this mulberry tree, and this became a niche item for China. And it wasn't a brief, snapshot in time that this was the case. China would sell silk to the rest of the world for centuries. In fact, in the 1800s, there would be a series of wars between Great Britain and China called the Opium Wars, and one of the bases to them was the imbalance of trade between Britain and China over several items, the most important being silk. China at the very beginning sold silk to India and then to Europe. Indians would trade back cotton and spices, Persians traded rugs, and Africa would trade gold, ivory, and nuts. The Mongols and the Silk Road. Eventually, the Silk Roads were temporarily shut down when China would go through periods of decline and rise, but they reemerged under the Mongols' protection when Genghis Khan took over the region, and then eventually his grandsons would break down the areas that he conquered into various khanates. One of the most important Mongols would be Kublai Khan, who was able to take over the Chinese region and establish the Ming dynasty. Under that dynasty and under the other khanates that formed, they were able to provide protection along the entire Silk Road area. And the Silk Roads would grow again as the Chinese dynasties of the Tang and the Song became stronger and expanded outwards. Exchanges. So one of the most important things about trade is the exchange of religions and cultures. Religions and cultures would be diffused and then they would be synthesized. For example, Buddhist monks were sent out by the Mauryan emperor of India, known as Ashoka. Ashoka sent out these Buddhist monks to spread their message out to China, and they also went west, probably all the way out to Egypt. As they did that, Buddhism changed. Originally, Buddhism was an ideology that was spread that believed in achieving a spiritual reality by letting go of the material reality. Yet, strangely enough, as Buddhism spread out along the trade routes, they formed two new sects called Theravada and Mahayana. Now, these two sects had a lot of differences, but overall their belief system was to allow for more material goods. In fact, they preached that by doing the right rituals and by doing the right prayers, you could achieve nirvana. That was not what the original Buddha preached. So why did we get to this point? Well, Buddhists, as they were traveling along the trade routes, realized that in order to try and get people to accept their belief systems, they would have to accept merchants and material trade. And so this changed Buddhism. However, there were other changes that took place as well, especially the passage of disease. Diseases were exchanged like smallpox and measles, and probably the most deadliest of all diseases, the Black Death. The Americas did not experience this problem at the time because they had a lack of domesticated animals and they were isolated. Now, this might sound like a good thing. Europe at the time would experience a lot of these diseases, and here's why. As you domesticated animals, a lot of times people would have to sleep in their barns with their animals at night to make sure that the animals didn't die from either predators or from bad weather. And so oftentimes animal diseases easily got passed off to other people, and then this got spread. So you might think, oh, this was a horrible problem for Europe. But actually, in the long run, while many Europeans did die from the Black Death, it also created much stronger immunities. When Europeans would later come into contact with people from the Americas, they had never developed these immunities. And so it would lead to a massive death for people once you had contact between the Europeans and the Americas. The Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean connected India to the Middle East and Eastern Africa and ended up creating numerous port cities along the coast of Eastern Africa in India. This allowed for the trade of bulk goods, and this is one of the big differences between the Indian Ocean and the Silk Road. Silk roads typically were traveled by domesticated animals, eventually camels, but this only allowed for a small variety of goods to be transferred back and forth, whereas when you had ships, you could transfer bulk goods across the seas. Now, one of the limitations was the weather itself. Ships would have to wait for monsoon winds to carry ships from one place to the next to allow for navigation. However, these monsoon winds within the Indian region were pretty predictable and happened pretty regularly each one of the years, and so this would allow for people to travel these bulk goods back and forth. It created a massive amount of diffusion of goods and ideas along the Indian coastline up to the Middle East and then over to Eastern Africa. Southeast Asia. So one of the things that happened because of the Silk Road, and probably more so because of the Indian Ocean trade, was the intermixing of numerous cultures and religions. For example, there was a kingdom forum called the Srivijava. Srivijava was the creation of an intermix of Hinduism and Buddhism. It led to monarchs justifying their rule through the idea of reincarnation, a central belief of Hinduism and, to some extent, Buddhism. Merchants also were justified by the belief of karma. Karma is the belief system within Hinduism that if you do good, there will be spiritual rewards, and if you do evil, there will be spiritual punishments. Merchants then could justify their actions that as long as they were doing good in what they were selling and they were good merchants, then they would be rewarded by having greater amounts of wealth. However, if they tried to cheat their customers, or if they tried to do things that were not really justified in economic trade, then they would be punished, and they would be punished basically by losing profit or by losing out in their business altogether. However, the merchants were always seen in this part of the world as a little bit questionable. Within the Indian caste system, merchants were placed in the middle. So why would that be the case? Well, they were seen as sort of a necessary evil. Basically, merchants were needed in order to drive the economy, but merchants are always self-interested. They were always interested in profit. And at this time period, remember, the Indian caste system, the Confucianist family piety, Western Europe's notion of the great chain of being all stressed the community over the individual. So merchants were always seen as sort of a necessary evil. For example, Confucianists also feared but tolerated merchants. Merchants were seen as necessary for economic growth, but all the time within Confucianist belief, the belief was they were self-interested and they lacked an understanding of the common good. Trans-Saharan Africa. So later on within world history, we're going to see the development of a Trans-Saharan African trade route. And the biggest reason for this taking place is the introduction of the camel. Once human beings are able to domesticate camels, this allows for travel from West Africa over to the Middle East. The biggest reason why is the camel can store so much water in its humps that it can go for a long period of time across the desert. In Western Africa, they would eventually trade ivory, gold, and slaves from Western Africa out to the Middle East. And it led to the creation of massive African kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, and Ghana. Slaves were stolen from communities within Central Africa that were called stateless societies. The stateless societies in Central Africa were tribal regions in which there were no kings. What there were secret societies, secret groups of elders who would run these societies. But because they were tribes, they were always vulnerable to these larger kingdoms who would come in and steal some of their inhabitants and then sell them off as slaves. About 5,500 were transported every single year as servants or government workers. And when I say that as servants or government workers, they were officially slaves and they were used in these positions. Eastern Africa. So, the Bantu tribes originally started off in the northwestern part of Africa, and they were forced out by climatic changes. As they settled along the eastern African coastline, they spread several things. They spread metallurgy, the creation of iron, and they also spread the Swahili language, creating Swahili city-states. These eventually became port cities that traded along the Indian coast and into the interior with Great Zimbabwe. So what the Bantu tribes become very important for in world history is the diffusion through their migration downwards and then the creation of these trade routes that begin to create a common African culture based upon the Swahili language and based upon trade out to India. the Americas. The trade zone created in North America, there was a trade zone, although they were isolated from Europe and the Middle East. The trade zone that was created in North America would be created through Tenochtitlan and down from the Mayans into the Andes. It tended to be very limited, and the reason why was that the Andes and the deserts in this region cut off a lot of trade. However, don't get confused and think there was no trade. There was trade throughout this region. In fact, some of the trade was pretty complicated. Down in the southern part of South America, the Incas would form, and they were actually able to create massive trade routes throughout the Andes Mountains. One of the problems that they faced was they lacked the kinds of pack animals that the Europeans would have. The Americans did have llamas, but llamas were not able to do quite the same amount of labor as horses and cows and bison were able to do out in Europe and in Africa. Very similarly, within the Americas, there was a group of merchants, and they were called the Poteca. The Poteca were the major merchants, and they traded back and forth jewelry and feathers, and that allowed to signify class hierarchy within societies like the Aztecs and the Incas. So why does any of this matter? Why should we make such a big deal out of trade? Human communities have always been connected since the beginnings of those villages and city-states that we've talked about during the sedentary time periods. All people, as they started to settle down, the sedentary communities settled next to rivers, and then they began trading with each other. This led to a massive diffusion of culture, goods, and diseases. And also we saw intermarriage, so we began seeing the beginnings of human civilization. There's an even bigger significance, though, that comes out of this. It's very important. As we get further and further into world history, there was a time period, especially in the 1800s, when there was an argument to be made that there were what's called pure societies, and it would eventually lead into much of what today we have as genetic racism. The idea that there are pure groups that went off and sort of established themselves and developed on their own. Actually, there's just no truth to this. Every single group that's out there is not pure. Instead, they have intermarried and intermixed with each other, and so we really don't have very fixed genetic groups that we can point to. And this means that there has been a sharing of everything from genetics to a sharing of information and cultural diffusion, which means that as a global community, we have far more in common and far more in sharing in our time here that we've been building civilizations. And so it's very difficult to separate out one group from the other.